Shalom to everybody. I appreciate everybody for thank you for coming over. We hopefully we should have, and the next time we should have more people. Anyway, Harav Yehuda fin shoes right. It's they have the organization of Torah Abayit Halacha Institute, right? So Harav is expert in all kind of medical questions, from all over the world, I'm talking, right? All over, they ask a question from him. I ask him all the time, right? All the question. Right now I have like 5 questions to ask. 5 questions they can, all the time, they come, no question they ask it. One of the questions that they told me, they asked me last night, if you give your home to somebody else, is it considered like
cheating?
Yeah, no, that's exactly called cheating. No, this is the word cheating, or I don't know what is it.
If you do,
if somebody says, let me have your homework, I want to copy it, and issue that. So I know you don't have to answer it now, but I'm just saying, that's why they just ask you, what I'm saying. For sure, the test for sure, that's not the question. That's not the question. But homework, let me just copy it over and then do it. That's the question. Liquid, I don't know, that's what they started to do that. Also, if you take that's the question, if you take a steak in a plastic, how much put in the cholent, is it considered hatmana? These are the questions that they ask me. That is something that nowadays, I don't know, they say they're doing liquid, so any problem with hatmana or not. I mean, I'm not saying I have to say, but I'm just saying right now focus is on the genetic. I'm just saying these are all questions that Baruch Hashem, people they want to know the halacha, and that's why he said in the time of the Mashiach, everybody is hungry for the
Devar Hashem.
Devar Hashem. Okay, please, Baruch.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Shimon. It's a big zechut to come to Ohel Vachel and to address the Kehillah. And the rabbi is doing such a special job here in the valley, Baruch Hashem, to be mechazek and Devar Hashem. And we should go mechayil lechayil, Bezat Hashem, where we should see a beautiful Mikdash Me'at very quickly with Beit HaMikdash. Amen. So the topic of today's shiur, Bezat Hashem, is about genetic screening for Sfaradim. And this is a very important topic and something which is not always so well understood. Just as a word of an introduction, the mitzvah of Puvu. So what I'll do is I'll be speaking genetic screening and the testing before somebody gets married, and also after somebody gets married as well, because we have single people, we have married people, and this is a very important topic. What is fascinating, and something which I've been speaking about all over my stay here in Los Angeles, is that the Mishnah in the Shulchan Aruch writes, Chayav kol ha'adam li'sa isha kadei lafot ve'la'abod, וכל מי שאינו עוסק בפריה ורבייה כאילו שופך דמים וממעט הדמות וגורם לשכינה שתסתלק מישראל. It's a very fascinating language which the Shulchan Aruch uses, where he talks about כל מי שעוסק בפרובו or כל מי שאינו עוסק, somebody who deals with the mitzvah of פרובו. And the commentators explain that it's not only the man and the woman who are osek peer review, everything behind it as well, whether it's introducing, making shidduchim, and trying to be more proactive of getting married, whether it's for yourself or for other people. So this is something which I really encourage people to do, that it should be a community effort for the mitzvah puruvu, especially here in Los Angeles. Sometimes there's a bit of people are a bit slow and may wait, so you need to have a bit more, be proactive in that mitzvah, and the mitzvah applies to every person, not only the single people, or even the people who know they're going to be getting married soon, already engaged, but even married people helping other people. It's very, very important. The Gemara in Nida explains, I'm going to give a bit of a scientific introduction here, that we have our genes and we have our DNA from our mother and from our father. The easiest way to understand it, and in a very simple way, is genes and DNA, or the chromosomes which we have, they're like a recipe. So i.e., if you want to make challah, if you want to make cookies, so you need a recipe. How much, it's like a code, or computer code. How much sugar, how much flour, how much oil, how much salt. That's what you need in order to make the recipe. So the DNA which we have, each and every one of us, we have these codes, and it's telling how the heart to grow and function, how the hair to grow and function, all the different bodily functions, and growth is controlled by the DNA. And we inherited 23 chromosomes, half the chromosomes from our mother and 23 from our father, every person. So if we imagine, let's say, a recipe book, because our parents also, each one, and our grandparents have two sets of genes which they got from their father and from their mother. And it passes down. So I got one half from my mother, one half from my father. If I did a blood test, I'll be able to know 50% of my genetic makeup is from my mother, 50% from my father, and it's different. That's why siblings, brothers and sisters, they don't look exactly the same. If they're identical twins, they will be, because that is, during conception, the embryo split. So they have identical DNA. That's why they'll always be the same gender. Identical twins will always be boys, they'll always be girls. There'll never be a boy and a girl. And there are different ways of, and that can affect anything from eye color, hair color, but also, chas v'shalom, genetic diseases, which you can pass on from one generation to another. So that's called inherited. There are other different types of genetic diseases. Some of them are called acquired. That means if somebody works in a place with a lot of chemicals and with dangerous chemicals, he could have a genetic mutation which will cause illness, but that wasn't hereditary. It wasn't inherited from his parents. It's something which he just acquired. We're going to be speaking about the inheritance, and it's passing on from one generation to another. Now, what is interesting is that there are different types. There's something called a recessive mutation. Because we have two copies of the genes from our father and from our mother, more often than not, all you need is one working copy. For whatever reason, I have two sets of genes that tell us how our heart functions and grows. Even if from our mother and from our father, from the whole of the billions and billions of genes which we have. Now, more often than not, it's enough if you have one working copy. So if, for example, you inherited from your father a faulty copy, it doesn't really make a difference, because you inherited from your mother a healthy copy, and that is going to overpower, and that's all you need. You only need one. That's called a recessive genetic disorder. That means, in other words, you're a carrier of a disease, or you're a carrier of a mutation, but you're not affected, you're not ill, you're just a carrier. But because you're a carrier, that means that you could pass it on to the next generation. But again, in order to be affected, and in order that you have the actual disease, you need to have a faulty gene from your mother and both from your father. That is a very important thing to understand. And if they're both faulty, then you're not only going to be a carrier, you're actually going to have the disease. Okay, is that clear? That is a really important point. That's called a recessive genetic disorder. And that's why, for example, many people know that different organizations where they talk about doing screening before you get married. What is that? You do a blood test, and then they search for certain genes and certain diseases, and they want to see if the Chatan and the Kala both have the same genetic mutation. Because if they both have the same one, there's going to be statistically 1 in 4 chance that the child is going to have the disease. So we don't want those people to marry in order that we're going to keep, the genetic diseases away. I will talk about what can be done, because there are ways of still be able to have healthy children, but that a little bit later, what is the solution to that problem. But ultimately, especially if somebody goes through the shidduch process before it gets too serious, so for example, there's an organization, I don't work for them, but they're different organizations. There's one called Dor Yesharim, one called Genetics. They have different names of organizations where they do basically more or less the same thing, where they check the genes, certain mutations, not all. Sometimes they check 15 different of the most common mutations. And the reason why we do that is because we don't want them to meet. So if they're going on a shidduch and they don't know the girl so well and they haven't committed 100%, and then they found out that, it's not compatible, then they say, okay, it's best that we don't get married. Sometimes they've already decided to get married and they want to get married and they don't want to cancel. And I'll give a bit later what is the options for these people. What can they do? Or even married couples who already got married, they never did the test, or the test only searches for certain mutations, not all diseases, and Khalila, one of their children, have an issue, and now they're asking what can they do that the rest of the children won't have this issue. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. What is fascinating is that there's a Gemara in Yevamot who talks about that somebody had a Brit Milah, and unfortunately the baby passed away. The Gemara in Yevamot Daf Samach Daled, and then we had another baby, and also they did the Brit Milah and passed away. And the Gemara says that you should not be doing any more Brit Milah in this family because there's already a Chazakah. Normally Chazakah is 3 times, but since we're talking about life and death, and the second baby died, they say you shouldn't do any more because we're worried that there's going to be a risk, and chas v'shalom, they're also going to pass away. Remember, Gemara continues and it talks about, okay, it's not only from one woman who had two boys who had Brit Milah, even if you had sisters. So we have different sisters, 2 sisters, and the first one had a boy, and the baby passed away in Brit Milah, and the second sister had a boy, and the baby passed away. So the rest of the sisters shouldn't have Brit Milah either. And what is fascinating, the Gemara says, Achayot mechaskot. Achayot mechaskot means that since it's something which passes through the mother. What is fascinating, we now know today that hemophilia is a disease where if somebody has a cut, normally when somebody has cuts themselves, so then we have a mechanism which it clots and it heals itself. Chas v'shalom, somebody with hemophilia, they don't have that mechanism, and they could literally bleed, to death because it won't clot unless they need to have medical intervention. Now, what is fascinating about this disease is that this disease it's what in medical terms is called X-linked. It only goes through the X chromosome. So, a female is XX. You have an X from the mother and you have an X from the father. So even if the mother gives the hemophilia gene to the daughter, since the father gives an X, a healthy copy, and we said in recessive diseases it's enough to have one healthy copy, the daughters would never be affected because the X of the father will be enough, to be able to not affect the child. However, a boy is X from a mother and a Y from a father. So there's no healthy X from the father. It's only an unhealthy X from the mother. It's called X-linked recessive inherited disease. It goes through the X, and this is something which only affects the boys and not the girls because of XXXY. And hemophilia is an X-linked genetic disease. So most probably the Gemara, which talks about, and the Rambam also says, and the Me'ivi says, V'zeu sheyachsu et ha'inyan ba'isha. That's what the Me'ivi says, and the Rambam also says, even if somebody, it's nothing to do with the husband, because it says even if one woman, she married two different men, and had a first child, and then Brit Milah he died in the second child, we don't connect it to the father. And it seems that it's talking about hemophilia because that's an X-linked disease which passes on. Only the boys suffer from it and not the girls. So that's a really fascinating idea which we see. The poskim of the last generation with Moshe Feinstein and the Sitz Eliezer, the Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Chacham Ovadia, they all discussed what would be the halacha if somebody, chas v'shalom, knows that he has a genetic disease which he's going to pass on to his children, and he doesn't want to do that, especially they used to, the most famous example and why the Jewish community is so big in screening is Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs was a very terrible disease which was very high in common statistically in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. It was about 1 in 35 people were carriers, and if they would marry someone else with the same Tay-Sachs mutation, there was a 1 in 4 chance that it was going to pass on to the children. And there was somebody, I think his name was Rabbi Exine or something like that. I'm not sure if he lived in Israel or in America, but he had a few children who had this disease, and they all passed away. It's a horrible, horrible disease where the children died very, very young. And he asked for poskim. This was well before genetic screening became popular, worldwide like it is now. And he basically set up an idea. He asked all the poskim. It was about 100 poskim signed that this should be done. And in order to keep away families from marrying each other when they have this specific disease. And at that time, the poskim discussed, is there a mitzvah of peru if they know their children are going to have this genetic disease? According to the Shulchan Aruch, Chalila, if somebody was fulfilled the mitzvah of peru, which is a minimum of a boy and a girl, and then one of them subsequently died, then he has not fulfilled the mitzvah. But here the question was, even if somebody, they will be able to live, but they're going to live a very difficult and life with a lot of different medical problems and issues. So the poskim, they talk about it. Is there a mitzvah? Is there not a mitzvah? But what is interesting, these teshuvot were written about 30, 40 years ago, and nowadays, I will explain, there are ways that we're able to circumvent those problems, that we could still have healthy children, even though people are carriers of genetic diseases. So, Dor Yesharim, for example, and even other organizations, Jewish organizations, where they deal with screening before getting married, what they normally do is they normally test the most common, the most dangerous, and the most they after they do the testing, they say, and they get all clear, you can get married. They think, okay, that's it. We're going to have 100% healthy children. Bezat Hashem, it should be. It just means that you don't have, you're not both carriers of those specific mutations which they check. It could be that there are other ones. It could be there are other problems. So that is something which is important to realize. The Gemara says in Yevamot, the same Gemara in Yevamot Samach Daled, it is put down in the Shulchan Aruch in the beginning of Even HaEzer, which talks about the laws of getting married. Lo yisa adam isha. You should not get married to a man or a woman. Lo me mishpachat mitzoraim velo me mishpachat nechvin. If there's a family, והוא שהוחזק 3 פעמים שיבוא ביניהם לידי כך. If there's a family who has certain medical conditions and there are at least 3 people in that family who have it, then you shouldn't marry them because there's going to be a high chance that your children are also going to have these issues. So we already see this is from the Shulchan Aruch, and that's why the poskim agreed that you can do the screening, because we don't want to have that issue in that way. Everybody, Bezat Hashem, would be able to get married. And with Moshe Feinstein, I'd like to read this out. He writes like this, because when he was asked regarding Tay-Sachs, when it first came to question, so he wrote in his Teshuvah, and what happens if you think it's a problem of doing the testing, because Tamim Tieh Im Hashem Elokecha, you have to be Tamim, you have to be believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does everything from the good, and you shouldn't. Rashi there writes on the pasuk in Chumash, Italech imo betmimut. You should walk in Hashem with tmimut, without making things too complex. Velo tachko acha ha'atidot, and you shouldn't be looking into the future. I know here in Los Angeles, every second store is psychic. I don't know. I haven't seen anywhere else. In London, where I'm from, in Israel, we definitely don't have it. I've never been. I'm sure it's not real psychics. In any case, but it's so common here. It seems that many people, the non-Jews, go there. But there is 100%. They don't know what they're really saying. It's just probably a good money-making machine. However, if there were people who could read the future, so the pasuk says, "Tamim tiem Hashem lekecha velo tachko et atidot." You shouldn't be looking into the future to see, should I marry this one? You can't go to a psychic and say, should I marry this girl? I'm worried. If there are going to be any potential problems in the future. So the Moshe Feinstein asks, is there an issue of doing the blood test to check if I have this genetic mutation because of Tamim Tiyeh Hashem Elokecha? And then he writes like this, Mikol Makom Kiven She'ata Na'aseh Zeh Ba'ofen Kal Livdok. It's very simple to check. יש לדון שאם אינו בודק את עצמו הוא כסקירת עיניים לראות מה שאפשר לראות. He's saying that you're not looking into the future, you're looking now. You want to check if there is an issue now. And if anything, it's as if you're closing your eyes to a potential problem which you could have stopped if you would have done the check. So he says, if you would have done the screening. So he said, it's not chas v'shalom, שאם יראה חס ושלום דבר כזה להווה הילד צער גדול מאוד מנבואי למי שצריך לישא אישה לבדוק את עצמו. ולכן טוב לפרסם הדבר. It should even publicize and advertise this, that people should read as they should be doing the testing, and there's absolutely no problem whatsoever of Tamim Tiyeh Hashem Elokecha, because you're not trying to look into the future. Rather, you're trying to determine now if you're a carrier, and if the Kalav is a carrier, and if you both are, then it's best not to get married. So there's absolutely no issue. Now, since those days of Tay-Sachs, so they expanded the amount of tests which they do. Now, what is fascinating, for some reason, the Ashkenazic Jewish population, more than any other ethnic group in the world, have more genetic disease which they inherit one to another than any other group in the world. Even all the non-Jewish groups in the world, the Ashkenazi Jewish, they have 93 very common, much more common than other groups, much more than the Sephardim, much more than the non-Jews, than any other group. They don't check all 93 because not all of them are deadly, not all of them are uncurable, because some of them you can take medication. You'll be able to leave. So why should they didn't want to intervene in that situation, because the child could take medication. Only the uncurable, deadly, and the very common ones. Similar to Tay-Sachs. But Tay-Sachs is the most famous one because it started because of that disease. And what is very important to understand is that within the Sephardic communities, and why is that? Because each community, especially, until, 50, 60 years ago, they were always stayed and stuck together, and they only married, as the Ashkenazim could have been in Eastern Europe, and especially in the times of the ghettos. So if there was any mutations, because sometimes mutations can just happen, mina shamayim, to a certain person, but it just stayed within the community because they only married Ashkenazim and people within the community, so that the gene, what we call the gene pool, all stayed in the community, never went out. And what is important to realize is that even with the Sephardic communities, each community have their own genetic problems. Now, they're not as bad and as serious and as many and even as common as the Ashkenazic ones. So they're the ones who have the main issues. But at the end of the day, each Sephardic group have their own. The Persians have their own diseases which are much more common than, let's say, the Syrians. But the Syrians have other ones, and the Egyptians, and the Temanim, and the Moroccans, each one. And that was for the same reason, because they all married within the same families, within the same communities, and therefore it wasn't able to spread out, much more. Nowadays, where Ashkenazim are marrying Sephardim and Persians are marrying Moroccans, so it's kind of spreading out, and it will become less common. But it is important to realize, and Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef, the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel, said recently that it is important for Sephardim also to do the testing. So normally in different organizations, you tell them from which origin are you. So if you're Persian, I know many Persians here in Los Angeles, or whichever origin you are, Syrian, Moroccan, you tell them, and they should, check. Sometimes it's an extra test to look for those genetic mutations which are common in that community. So that is a really important thing, because it is true on the one hand that you normally hear, Sephardim don't need to do the testing. There's a bit of truth in there, i.e. it's not as common and not as deadly and not as problematic as the Ashkenazi community, but it still is quite common. And if people want to get married, I definitely recommend that they should, speak to one of the organizations and do the test. Now,
sorry, do they know what they're looking for?
Yes, so they know exactly. I didn't bring it with me, but I have a list of each community. A lot of research has been done. Has its own specific, potential genetic mutations, which are much higher than the general population. Every Jewish community. And what they do is they will check those special, specific mutations to see if they have it. It basically does work on statistics, and what I said before is that it doesn't mean if they say, you get married, your child's going to be this perfect thing. There's a lot of work to do, not just doing this genetic testing, but it's the main, most common and deadly, difficult diseases. So I definitely think 100%, and it's not only me from my experience, the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef, the son of Chacham Ovadia, and all the Sephardi poskim in Israel say that the Sephardim also should do the test, but they need to mention what their origin is, so they would check those specific mutations which could be. Now, what is the option? This is what I'm not going to go into too much detail, but at the end of the day, this is a very common question which people ask me. They tell me, listen, I met this girl and we want to get married, and we found out that we have the same, we're both carriers of the genetic, the same genetic disease, and we have a 1 in 4 chance. So that means if they have 4 kids, statistically, one of the children will have, it could be more, you never know. It's just statistically, if you have 8 kids, statistically we'll have 2 children. What do? We want to get married. Or if they didn't do the test and they found their first kid has a genetic disease, and only afterwards they did the genetic testing, what do we do? So there is a process, it's called PGD, which basically it's within the fertility process where they can check an embryo before the woman basically becomes pregnant. I'm not going to go into all the details. It's a very fascinating procedure which nowadays they can do, that they can check an embryo in a lab under a microscope. They can take out one cell, because each cell which we have carries the whole of our DNA. So if they had cases like this, so for example, in the Twin Towers, or whenever they have a case where somebody has died and they want to, identify the body, but they can't because of it was burnt, but you have a teeth, or you have some hair, or you have some skin, whatever it is, each and every cell in the body, it's like with a COVID test, what are they doing? They're checking your DNA. They're looking for the COVID infection. Every time you can check. They have cases in Israel, for example, or around the world, not only in Israel. It's very interesting that if they for example, there was a robbery or there was a murder, and they found, by the murder scene, a cigarette. So what they do is they found a drink. Somebody drank from a bottle. So what they'll do is they'll check, or they'll scan. Do you see sometimes you see these you see pictures? You have people that they wear these white suits and they go around brushing.
Forensic file.
Why are they doing that? Why are they wearing these white suits? They're not worried of being, getting any chemicals infected in them. This was before COVID, But what they're trying to do, they don't want to contaminate the scene with their own DNA. So they wear these full Hamza suits, and they go around searching for, maybe they have, a hair came out, or maybe they used a tissue, or maybe they had a cigarette and they have a cigarette butt, and what they do is they take the saliva, they put it in a slide, and then they check in their records if they have something similar. So there are cases like this now. What they do is they can exonerate people for murder, and by proving, the DNA which they had at the crime scene isn't matching that person. There was a case in Israel, an unbelievable case. There was a murder like 30 years ago, and they managed to get some DNA, but they didn't find a match. But we knew which car he drove, and what happened was somebody else got arrested. It was a cousin of his. Any person who gets arrested, so what they do is they'll take DNA and they'll keep it on the computer. Now, because he was a cousin of a guy who murdered him, they had a very similar DNA, because like I said, I have 50% from my mother, from my father. I have the same with my brothers and sisters. But with a cousin you have less, but you have about 1/8 of the DNA of a cousin. So when they checked, this guy, he just stole something from, the gas station. They checked his DNA, and they saw but it was very similar DNA to this murder 30 years ago. It had one name, so they knew it was a relative. So what they did was they knew also the car, but they couldn't find the person, so they went back and then they had one suspect because this guy had the same car 30 years previously. But how are they going to get his DNA? So they had some undercover detectives following him, and what they did was when he smoked a cigarette, he threw it on the floor. When he moved away, they took the cigarette because they had the DNA venom, and they said they found an exact match from his cigarette, because the saliva on his cigarette to the DNA which they had taken 30 years ago, and then they arrested this guy. So you can do it from any part of the body. It can be a hair, it can be a blood test, it could be from saliva, from any cells. It could be. And what they do is during the infertility process where they have embryos in the lab, what they can do before they return it to the mother, they can check the embryo and they can look and see if it's a healthy embryo with that genetic disease or not, because we said it's a 1 in 4, and maybe they have 10 embryos in the lab, and the doctors will check and see if they have this genetic disease, so they won't return that embryo, and if they don't, then they will. So there are many halakhic questions within this procedure which you need to have halakhic guidance, and the rabbi can forward any questions to me in this issue. But in essence, there are ways which HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought the chokhmah to the doctors, where most of these genetic diseases were able to still get married to that woman which you wanted to, and you're both carriers, without passing it on to the children. I'd like to finish with, I have some question and answers in a few minutes. I just want to finish with something really, really insightful. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avot writes, in Perek Hey, chapter 5, Mishnah 2, Ashara Dorot minoach ve'ad Avraham. There were 10 generations from Noah to Avraham. And in the following Mishnah, Mishnah Gimel, he writes, Ashara nisyonot nitnesa Avraham Avinu elav shalom ve'amad bekulam. There were 10 challenges which Avraham Avinu, the 10 nisyonot which Avraham Avinu had, and he managed to stand up to all the challenges. He conquered all those challenges. But there's an interesting subtle nuance and difference between these two Mishnah. And I'm going to read it again. Asara dorot minoach ve'ad Avraham. Asara nisyonot nitnesa Avraham Avinu. What's the difference? In the first Mishnah, they call him Avraham. In the second Mishnah, they call him Avraham Avinu. Why the change? This, the Chaim Velozhin, I've read this Mishnah dozens of times, I never noticed that difference. But we know every word of a Mishnah is like gold. It's not put there just for any reason. And there's a reason, because either they should have called him Avraham in both Mishnayot, or called him Avraham Avinu in both. Why the change? Why in the first one just Avraham, and in the second one Avraham Avinu? This was asked by the Chaim Velozhin, the famous disciple student of the Gaon Vilna.
Maybe before the challenge,
for
the 10, and then after Avraham Avinu, after the 10.
So what beautiful. So this is, he says, the most incredible idea. He says there are only 3 avot and 4 imahot. In order to become an avinu, it's not just being a father. That's one level, obviously. But to be an avinu in the real sense of the word, of avot, was only after he managed to stand up to the challenges. That's when he became the avinu. So in the first Mishnah, it was just talking about the 10 generations. And it's more just explaining the timeline from a historical point of view. So they just called him Avraham. But Asara Nisyonot, the 10 challenges, which Avraham Avinu managed to conquer, then he became an an Avinu. And he's teaching us that, he writes, Mitalech betumot tzaddik ashrei banav achavav. If somebody goes and reaches the level of a tzaddik, his children are going to be blessed. Why? Ki kama midot she'tzaddik terach v'yageh le'asigam. All the effort that a person does, a righteous person does, in order to become greater from a spiritual point of view, the kids afterwards, they don't have to work as hard to reach the level of a father, because the father's already made it easier for him. And then he says something incredible. And he writes like this, just like we see amongst many people, Jewish people, the Muslim atzmam al-Kiddush Hashem. Unfortunately, we know from the Holocaust, we know all the different inquisitions which for Jewish people, even people who are not religious whatsoever, very far from Judaism, they sacrifice themselves on Kiddush Hashem. So he writes, Vehu mutba banu me'avam avinu. That power came from Avraham Avinu in the challenge of all kasdim, when he jumped into the fiery furnace and he wanted to die on Kiddush Hashem. V'chol asara nisyonot, all the 10 challenges which happened to Avraham Avinu, because he conquered it, it makes it easier for us. And then he writes, and this is something which you see, the love, why people suddenly have a התעוררות לאדם פתאום ללך לארץ הקודש. Some people, I live in Israel now, and suddenly I see a guy, he's speaking in English. I say, where are you from? San Diego. He's not religious. You have family here? No. You're on vacation here? No, I moved here. You have work here? I'm looking. Why are you coming? What are you doing here in Israel? I said, I just have, he left everything. And that is from the nisayon of Lech Lecha me'artzecha, me'molodatcha, me'beit avicha, el asher ayecha. That love, that passion for Etz Yisrael comes from Avraham Avinu. Many people, Choseh b'tshuvah, they leave their families, they went to public school. You have people in communist Russia, they was very atheist, and then suddenly they just felt this spiritual spark explode in them. Where did that come from? He said that came from Avraham Avinu, who's Avraham Ivri. And this is what we have to understand, because not only we've been speaking about genetic diseases, if we want to become an Avinu, and whether you're married or not, it doesn't make any difference, because they say, we just had Tu B'Shvat last week, so they say, when is the best time to plant a tree? So the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. When is the second best time to plant a tree? Today. So that's how we have to work as well. Also, before the mitzvah of Puvu, the best time, people think, when am I going to start, working on chinuch of the kids? It's before you get married, because you have to work on yourself and you have to be able to overcome challenges that you're going to be that person where it's going to be much easier to raise a family, because there are many challenges of raising a family. And that's what we have to learn, and that's, if you like, the spiritual genetics of Am Yisrael, that every time we overcome something and our children see that, then they're going to be able to overcome their own challenges, because we have set them the right way, and if you like, in their spiritual DNA. So I finish now the shiur, and if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to try and answer them.
You said, what's this PGD?
So PGD basically means pre-implantation genetic, I forgot what the D stands for, diagnosis. So what they're doing is, before the embryo is returned to the mother, it's all done in a lab. Before they return it to the mother, they will diagnose. They'll take out one cell, because like I said, you only need one cell. It's an amazing thing. So there are halachic concerns in the whole process. In essence, it is okay, but it needs to have halachic guidance, throughout the process, because there could be many questions which come up, during the actual process of PGD and this treatment. But this is something which can be done. I know many people, Baruch Hashem, they have a certain genetic disease, and they don't want to pass it on to the kids, and it's quite expensive. Here, at least in America, it costs about $20,000. But people tell me that's worthwhile putting, that investment, in order to have healthy children. In Israel, it's free. But that's also the whole the whole infertility treatment in Israel is free. It's for whatever reason. Here in America, it's much more expensive. Yes.
What about Down syndrome? How does that work?
About
Down syndrome?
Down syndrome. Okay, so Down syndrome is called sporadic. What that means is that it's not inherited. It's a chromosomal problem. It's called trisomy 21. If we have 46 chromosomes, 36 from my mother, 23 from my mother, 23 from my father, somebody with Down syndrome, they have chromosome 21, they have 3 of them. It's normally from a mother. But that is something, it's called sporadic, but what we call min hashamayim. There's nothing that you can stop, because the parents don't have Down syndromes which they're passing on to the kids. It's just there's this, from a medical point, again, it's min hashamayim, but there's this, at conception, there's some sort of, what happens is that the cells keep on copying itself. As we're talking, as when we're sleeping, the cells in our body are always copying itself, and they're always, it's in essence, the cells which we have now aren't the same as they were 10 years ago, because we've completely, copied, just like on a computer code, you've copied, and during the process, sometimes there are mistakes. And that's what happens during conception. Normally it happens the older you are. So a woman at the age of 20, there's, let's say, a 1 in 2,000 chance of having a child with Down syndrome, but there's nothing that can be done to stop it. A woman of the age of 40 might be 1 in 200 chance. It's normally to do with age, because this copying mechanism, for whatever reason, as you get older, becomes more problematic. But that also means that just because you're offered a girl or a boy and they have a sibling with Down syndrome, that won't bear any, if it's sporadic and it just happens, there's going to be no issue there that, I might have a kid with Down syndrome, but it's not something genetic, let's say like Tay-Sachs is, or other genetic diseases.
If they take away the cell, does that mean that the child is no longer a carrier? Meaning the child.
No, they don't take away the cell. They don't take away the cell. What they do is, let's say they have an embryo with 32 cells, because every day it's becoming bigger and bigger. They take out one cell just to check if it's a carrier, if it's affected by this disease or not.
And if it is?
So if it is affected, and it's with this disease, so they won't return it to the mother. They will only return the healthy ones. But you can't take out the cell. At the moment, we don't know, medicine doesn't know how to, genetically alter, the mutation in order to make it healthy.
So, but if the child does have it, then they remove, you mentioned, what do they do? How do they prevent the child from getting it?
They don't. Let's say they have 5 embryos. They just won't use it.
Okay.
Let's say normally what happens during this process, they can get, let's say, 5, 10, 20 embryos, however many there are, and they will just check for ones which are healthy. The ones which are unhealthy, they'll just disregard. And the ones which are healthy, then they will return it to the woman. It's quite a complex process, and there are many halakhic issues there, but they're not treating the actual disease. They're just basically selecting the healthier baby without that specific disease.
So it would have the same halakhic concerns as IVF? Or?
It is. So it's the next level of IVF. It's exactly IVF, where they have in vitro fertilization. They have a fertilization in the lab. But the next stage is that we're going to check. Normally they don't check in IVF. You have an embryo and you return the embryo. Here they take out one cell check the embryo and to see. They could theoretically check if it's male or female as well. There are many things they could check. I mean, you can kind of choose from the embryos which you have which one you want. But normally, they just check it for genetic diseases. So it's not a standard process. It's only somebody who already knows they have a genetic issue, because it's not, otherwise, most people are well and healthy. So, but this is a very good thing for people who know they have a genetic disease, or a couple who want to get married and we know. So basically they would have to, again, I'd have to go into much more detail, but it's good to know. I'll finish off with an amazing story. I had a case of a guy who was blind. He was blind, and his brother was blind, and it was genetically linked. And it was an amazing person. He was a Talmid Chacham. He used to learn. They have a machine which can turn Sfarim into Braille, so they can learn. So he studies either through listening to Shiurim or through Braille, and in this school which he was, any book which they have, it will just automatically translate it into Braille. So on Shabbat, or when he can't listen, he'll be able to study. And he wanted to get married, and it was difficult because he's blind, and the only people they offered him to marry was either somebody who was also blind or somebody who was disabled in a wheelchair. Now, he didn't have an issue with someone being disabled because he himself was disabled, but he just said, how are we going to look after our kids if we're both blind, or if my wife's disabled? It's just going to be impossible, just practically. So obviously Shidduchim was hard, and in the end, he found what was the story? This woman, when she was a young girl, she was in a horrific accident. She was scarred for life in a way where, nobody wanted to marry her because she had this visible injury, which was horrific. She was a great woman. Everything else was fine, and she was healthy, and she was smart, and she had a good job. But it was very difficult. But with this blind guy, it was Zivuk min hashamayim. And she also was a bit older as well. She was approaching 40, which, that's when it becomes more difficult. And they also they didn't want to have he didn't want to have kids who were blind. But, from her being able to look after the kids, she would be able to. So I gave him assistance and guidance where they can do this procedure in order to, and because of her age as well, it was something which she, she needed to do. So we were able to keep them, Baruch Hashem, having many more kids, and healthy kids, at least without those issues, because of that. So, Baruch Hashem, there are many ways where you're able to help people, Baruch Hashem. Any more questions?
Yeah. So what kind of testing happens when an Ashkenaz person wants to marry a Sephardi person?
What type of testing?
Yeah, because you do testing.
Ashkenazi and Sephardi.
Yeah, so is there specific tests made for Ashkenazi people that are marrying Sephardi people? Is that a different test they would both do, or?
Well, there's really two types. It depends which organization you go through, but some of them have the regular testing, which is more Ashkenazi based. Like I said, it all started from them. And then you just add. So you just need to do both, really. You don't need to. It's just I don't know. I think there may be 10 different diseases which aren't common so common with Ashkenazim, which the Sephardim do. But they're different organizations. Some do open testing, i.e. they give you the results, and some have closed testing. So they won't give you the results, but they will tell you if there's a match or not. And if you marry an Ashkenazi, then or Sephardi, you should say, let's do the extra Sephardi testing as well. That's what I told my kids to do as well when they did the test, because they did it, you normally do it even before you start Shidduchim, so it's just there on record.
It seems like the Rabbanim unanimously, they all agree that if there is a genetic, like you mentioned, in the Shulchan Aruch and stuff, if there's a genetic reason, it's better not to get married, right?
I mean,
right.
it's better not to. The problem, so if you're being set up with a girl and a shidduch, it's much easier because you don't have that, connection, and you're in any case not so sure. So it's easier to, say, okay, let's not go ahead. But if you met the girl and you really like her for whatever reason, and you still want to get married, or you didn't do the test only afterwards, so that is an option.
My question is, since that's the case, would it be possible to say that maybe it's not a zivug, because if the Rabbanim agree that if there's a genetic testing, it's better not to.
Okay, that's a very fascinating question there. I wouldn't say it's not your zivug, but like Feinstein says, you're just trying to avoid, the problems. If you have very often, especially with, in the more formal communities, we don't just go out and meet the girl and, decide, go out and then decide whether we want to get married. So in any case, you have, you could be suggested this one or that one or this, and everyone wants to look at the midah, they want to look at the personality, the family, each what's important to every person. So here as well, it's like if Khalila, you heard somebody, listen, she had a terrible disease when she was young. So you might say no, but a rabbi might say no, but to say is that your zivug or not your zivug is a different question. At the end of the day, we'll have.
If you follow the advice of the Rabbanim, then you wouldn't go through with it. So meaning, is it possible to follow the advice of the Rabbanim and it still be your zivug, but you're not marrying her because it's the advice of the Rabbanim?
Again, this is a question which is difficult to answer, because how the mechanics of zivug exactly works and how your bechira plays in, the zivug process is a very complex thing. So, no, but you're asking a brilliant question. You're saying now.
A decision then, because maybe. So I was thinking maybe it's an easy decision. If that's the case, I'll follow the advice of the Rabbanim, and it's not meant to be. Or maybe it's.
Well, there's a difference between not meant to be or deciding not to choose that. I would look at it this way. This is, narrowing down your zivug options, but that doesn't mean if you're both carriers that you didn't marry your zivug.
Right, I hear that.
Okay, but it is a very difficult concept, to really understand.
How's it work with diabetes? Let's say there's a family that diabetes is very common, let's say type 1. And so how would one go around that? What are the genetic concerns with that? Should a person decide not to even date to begin with, or?
So type 1 diabetes can be, especially if it's very common in the family, it can definitely be genetically. That's something, for example, which they won't test, because if that's a dominant genetic disease, they won't test for it. They normally just test for the recessive ones. Where you're both carriers. But if the Gemara says, again, many people can live diabetes for many, many years. Sure, there might be health issues there as well. What is important, that if somebody knows they have diabetes, or that's a choice which they have to, disclose that to the shidduch as well, because that's a serious, health condition, even though it can be treated. It's not something which you're allowed to, ignore and hide. And, from a halachic point of view, and it will cause a lot, and any serious, medical or genetic issue, you should always ask the rabbi, what do I need to tell and when do I need to tell? Because very often we don't tell them to, especially in the shidduch process, we don't say straight away. Because otherwise, I'm never going to get married. No, automatically I'm going to, say no. So it is important, to tell that and to disclose it, but only once there's a, a good connection, and then they can make that decision. Each genetic disease, will have to be looked at, individually, because some are manageable, some of them you can live with, and it won't really impact the quality of life whatsoever, because of the advances in medicine and technology. but some of them can be very, very difficult, and diabetes as well. If there is a very, high chance that her kids will have diabetes, then that certainly is a reason not to go forward in there. If the brothers, the uncles, and for whatever reason, but each genetic disease will have to be looked in, because not everything, like Down syndrome, is going to be passed on to the next generation, and we don't have to, be overly worried of something which, if there isn't a chance where it's going to, you have to look in each disease specifically, what are the chances it's going to, continue. And sometimes they could even check if they're carriers as well. If someone wants to get married and it's not on that organization's screening test, and we really want to get married, they could just say, okay, let's screen for this. If everything's clear, obviously it's a difficult thing, how you say it and how we go through. But maybe they'll be happy, or maybe they would know as well. And so that's very, very important. And like I said, always good to ask the rabbi and to give you guidance.
Thank you much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.